In this lecture, we are going to talk about plant reproduction and growth patterns. We are going to start by talking about flowers, fruits, and seeds in angiosperms, which are the flowering plants. Then we will talk about cones and gymnosperms and gametophytes as the generation that makes sperm and eggs in the ferns and the bryophytes. Next, we're going to compare and contrast complex and simple-bodied plants. We're going to talk about localized and diffuse growth and which parts of the plant do each of those. We will talk about indeterminate compared to determinate growth, and again, which parts of the plants do each of those. We will talk about polycarpy and monocarpy, which refer to different strategies for how often in the plant's life it makes seeds. We're going to talk about 3 different strategies of reproduction that are annuals, biennials, or perennials, and these refer to whether a plant lives for 1 year, 2 years, or more than 2 years. And we will end by contrasting herbs versus woody plants. So we will start with reproductive organs in the flowering plants or angiosperms. And the organ that is going to be most important here are the flowers. Flowers make both ovules and pollen. The ovule is a structure that we'll talk about more later in the semester, and we will specify now at least that the ovule always contains an egg. We will also talk about pollen later in the semester. For now, all we'll say is that pollen is a small structure for dispersal and that it will eventually make the sperm. Just like in animals, the sperm will fertilize the egg. After that happens, then the ovule can mature into a seed, and the flower that contains that ovule can mature into a fruit. So we've been talking about flowers. We will give a more precise definition here and then start talking about the parts of a flower. A flower is a specialized organ of angiosperms that facilitates pollination and protects the seed during development. So there's nothing like this structure in gymnosperms or in other plants. And the structure doesn't really do anything else except to help with the process of receiving pollen and making seeds. In that sense, it is specialized. We will be talking a whole lecture later in the semester about the process of pollination and some variation in how different plants do that. And we'll talk in just a minute about the fact that the ovules in here develop into seeds. So as we go over the parts of the flower, we are going to start at the base and we are going to work our way up and progressively inward into the flower. So if we start down here at the very base, we have a stem-like structure that leads to the flower. This is called the pedicel. And then there's a basal part of the flower to which all other flower parts attach, including the sepals, the petals, the anthers, and the carpel. So this basal tissue is called the receptacle. We will now work our way in, and there are going to be 4 layers within the flower itself, and we will start with the outermost one here, which are the sepals. So the sepals and petals sometimes look similar to each other, oftentimes though they look pretty different. When they do look, well, in all cases, the sepals are the outermost layer. They're always below and outside of the petals. In most cases, they are going to be green and protective. So they are not serving a role of attracting pollinators. They're really there to protect the flower bud and perhaps to eventually protect the flower and fruit. The next layer in are the petals. In many species, they are bright and attractive. For example, on this flower, they're bright yellow and large. And when they are bright and attractive, that is the case to help attract pollinators. pollinators are ultimately going to be the animals that move pollen from the anthers to the stigma, which we will be talking about next. And so to make it easy to see, so the pollinators know where to go, then selection has favored flowers that have large and brightly colored petals. So the two parts that we just talked about, the sepals and petals, are not directly involved in reproduction. They might play an indirect role by attracting pollinators, but they don't contain either sperm or eggs. We're going to move in now to the carpel. Actually, let's skip ahead one slide. We're going to go ahead and talk about the stamen next, and we'll come back to the carpels, just so we can stay in the order that these plants appear from the outermost to the innermost. You can see outermost was the sepal, then the petal. The next in would be the stamen. Stamen are structures for pollen production. They typically have two parts. The most important part is the anther, which is depicted up here on the diagram. And the anther has multiple pouches, and it's within these pouches that pollen is produced. These pouches will eventually open to allow pollinators to collect that pollen and move it elsewhere. To facilitate the process of pollinators contacting this pollen, it is useful for the flower for these structures to be up here, not way down at the base of the flower. So there's another structure called the filament that is just this connective tissue shown here, and this connective tissue holds up the anther, getting it a little bit closer to the entrance to the flower. We're going to go back now to the slide about the carpels. So carpels are a structure for pollen receipt and seed production. They typically have three different parts, and we'll talk about them in order from top to furthest down. So up here at the top, and you can see it's labeled here, the stigma. This is the part where pollen lands. When the flower is receptive to pollen, this will typically be moist or sticky to help the pollen, which is sort of dust-like in size and appearance, to help it stick to the surface. The pollen is going to land, and as we'll talk about later in the semester, it's actually going to germinate. So a little tube is going to come out of each pollen grain and start growing. And that pollen has to grow all the way down to the ovules. So there's this long bit of connective tissue here through which that pollen tube will grow. This connective tissue is called the style. Once the pollen reaches down here, it will enter one of the ovules, or at least its sperm will be transmitted into the ovule where it can fertilize the egg. There is this chambered area down at the bottom with a wall around it. This portion of the carpel is called the ovary. So the ovary is the bottom part, and it includes the chamber or chambers that contain ovules. This whole structure together is called the carpel. Now, in some books, you will also hear about the pistil, and the relationship between a carpel and pistils a little bit confusing. Basically, a pistil is the word for it when multiple carpels fuse together into one structure. For our purposes, I will use the terms interchangeably, which is a little bit wrong, but I think a reasonable simplification, and I will try to simply use the word carpel for consistency. Once the ovules are fertilized and that the ovules begin to mature into seeds, while that process is happening, the ovary around those ovules is also maturing, and it matures into a structure called a fruit. Of course, you are familiar with fruit from our use of that word in terms of human foods, and so you have some sense of what this means already. Botanically speaking, it's going to be a mature ovary with seeds inside. Oftentimes, that mature ovary is going to become fleshy. So an example of that are autumn olive fruits. These are a plant that we might find growing around campus or around South Carolina. They are an introduced plant that are not particularly desirable. But the reason that they spread so effectively is that because these fruits are fleshy, they are an attractive food source for birds. Birds eat these fruits, then they move somewhere else, and when they defecate, the seeds are left behind, and those seeds can then germinate and start new plants. So one of the functions of fruits, which I'm jumping a little bit ahead here, but fruits function by aiding in dispersal. And animal dispersal is one of the major ways that this happens. If you think about the fleshy fruits that you're familiar with from the supermarket, then a reasonably similar process is true. We might take an apple on a hike, eat the apple, and leave the seeds behind, for example. So fruits can also help in dispersal in other ways. I'm going to show you two examples here. Let's look at this bottom right example first. And these are the fruits that we would find on a maple tree. In the fall, you've probably seen these scattered around lawns, or sometimes even falling out of a tree and helicoptering their way down. As you can see, this fruit has wings on it. And what these wings are doing are helping the wings catch the air and therefore helping the fruits disperse a little bit further away from the tree. This is going to be important because the tree doesn't want its offspring to try to establish in this shade right under it. Instead, it wants them to disperse far enough away that they end up in a light gap where they have a better chance of establishing. So we've talked about animal dispersal with the Russian olive or autumn olive fruits. We've talked about wind dispersal with the maple fruits. Another way that fruits can help with dispersal is by floating. And the classic example of this we are familiar with are coconut fruits. So coconuts are characteristic of, let's say, Gary Larson cartoons, where there's a small desert island with some coconut trees on it, and usually some poor person that has been caught there by a shipwreck. So we'll ignore the person and how he got there. Instead, let's focus on how the coconuts got there. The coconuts are able to disperse to these oceanic islands because they are able to float. So they can get dropped on one island. If they get picked up by waves, let's say in a storm, then they have at least a small chance of making it to another island where if the waves are just right, they might get washed up on shore and be able to germinate and start new trees. And so this is an adaptation that you would particularly find in island plants. That's a little bit then about flowers and fruits. We will come back and talk more about the sort of nitty-gritty details of how pollination and fertilization occurs. For now, I want to move on and talk briefly about how the other major plant groups achieve reproduction. We said earlier in a different lecture that gymnosperms are cone plants. This is just a reminder that yes, gymnosperms have cones and they do not have flowers. Since they don't have flowers, remember they also never have fruits. Instead, they always have cones. They have two kinds of cones. Unlike flowers, not all flowers, but most flowers make both pollen and ovules. In the case of cones, cones always either make ovules, in which case they are called ovulate cones, and these are the ones that we're familiar with. If you pick up a pine cone from under a pine tree, that will always be an ovulate cone. We might call them female cones. That's not technically correct, although it relates to the fact that they are going to be the ones with the ovules and the eggs. The other kind of cones are the pollen cones, and as the name implies, these make pollen. Pollen cones are very small, and they don't tend to stick around very long. So an ovulate cone like this is going to have to last on the tree long enough to fully mature, get pollinated, let that pollen fertilize the ovule, and then have the seed develop. That process can take more than 2 years. During that 2 years, there's going to be rainstorms and maybe snowstorms and wind, and it would be very easy for a flimsy structure to get broken or fall off the tree. So ovulate cones tend to be very sturdy. The pine cones, or the pollen cones rather, have a much easier function. All they need to do is persist for long enough to make pollen and release that pollen, and then they are done. So pollen cones tend to be small, flimsy, and they dry out pretty quickly. You'll sometimes notice these in spring at the end of branches. They're out at the end of the branch to make it easy for wind to pick up the pollen as it gets released and carry it off to an ovulate cone. These entire cones might be on the order of a centimeter to a few centimeters long. So that's maybe a 1/4 inch up to an inch or two long. Since we've talked about how reproduction occurs in angiosperms and gymnosperms, let's go back and do a quick reminder of how this process works in ferns and bryophytes. We did talk about bryophyte life cycles, or rather fern life cycles already. They do have a very similar life cycle. Remember that in both of these plants, there are 2 free-living generations, one of which is haploid and one of which is diploid. Ferns and bryophytes never make seeds. They are not seed plants. They do not make pollen. They do not make cones, and they do not make flowers. Instead, if we focus on the ferns here, the ferns have a larger generation that is the sporophyte generation, and that makes haploid spores which get released, and those spores by mitosis develop into a mature fern gametophyte, like the one pictured here. This is going to be a very small plant. It might be on the order of millimeters to a centimeter across. It'll be sitting on the surface of the soil, and unless you're looking very closely, you might step on it, but you would never notice that it was there. It is in this generation, the gametophyte generation, that we get the formation of, this says pollen or eggs, and it should not say pollen. That's a typo. This should say sperm or eggs. So please fix that in your notes. I will go ahead and change it in the PDF, so hopefully by the time you get these notes, pollen will be replaced here by the word sperm. That was a general overview of reproduction in angiosperms, gymnosperms, and ferns. We're going to move on now to talking about some very general categories of way organisms develop and reproduce. And we'll contrast how this occurs in plants and in animals in some cases. So the first distinction we'll make is between complex and simple body plants. Plants have simple modular growth. So this means that plants get larger by creating repeating units. We're familiar with this, for example, with the fact that plants are covered with leaves. So leaves are one module of plants and they repeat over and over. Similarly, roots repeat over and over, stems repeat over and over, as do flowers and eventually fruits. This is pretty different than how an animal develops. It is true that humans or other animals have some repeating units, like our fingers are pretty similar to each other, our teeth are similar to each other, but we have many more kinds of units, and many of them we only have one or a couple of those units. For example, we have only one heart and one liver, only 2 kidneys, etc. So generally we could say many animals have complex body plans. By contrast, plants tend to have simple body plans. Having a simple body plan does not mean plants are doing something worse than animals. There are advantages for each approach that relate to how the different kinds of organisms make a living. For plants, the nice thing about being modular is that the loss of some modules does not typically lead to the death of the entire organism. For example, I just had a large branch break off a tree in my yard, and that branch obviously is now dead. That's one module. But that didn't necessarily mean that the rest of the tree was going to die. The rest of the tree could have lasted substantially longer. Focusing on animals, animals have complex growth patterns. So I just mentioned some organs that don't repeat a lot in animals. If we think about their systems, animals have a sensory system, a digestive system, an immune system, a circulatory system, and a nervous system, just as some of the examples. Plants don't have this many different systems. In an animal, the loss of any one of these symptoms can lead to its death. So if an animal can no longer digest, it can't acquire energy or nutrients, and it would die. If an animal is unable to sense its environment because its nervous system stops working, then it would again be unable to eat, and it would perish. Similarly, if the circulatory system stops, we would have similar problems. So a disadvantage then to animals is that if they lose one of their systems, they're not going to be able to survive it. There are advantages, though, to having a complex body plan. So the complexity of animals allows us to do things like move around. That's something that plants can only do very, very slowly as they grow, but they can't move around without growth. An animal, in contrast, if you want some food, you could just go over to the refrigerator to get it. The complex body system is also going to allow us to acquire specialized food. So we use our eyes, we use our muscles, we use other senses, for example, when we're acquiring food, and then we digest that food in our digestive system. So it's necessary to be a complex organism because animals tend to acquire specialized foods. For a plant that is basically making its food out of water, some gases, sunlight, and some soil nutrients, then that complexity is not necessary and could be a hindrance. Another general distinction that we could think about across both plants and animals is the difference between localized versus diffuse growth. In localized growth, cell division occurs in specialized regions called meristems. We've talked about that already. We talked about that in stems, and we said that the stem apical meristem, or the shoot apical meristem, is at the very tip of the shoot. We talked about axillary buds that have meristematic tissues at each node. And then when we talked about roots, we said the very tip of the root, beneath the root cap, has a root apical meristem, or ram. So wherever there is a meristem, the result is localized growth. A meristem is an area of actively dividing cells. Implicitly, that's implying that the other cells that are not part of that meristem are not dividing. And so we said that occurs in stems and roots. The other possibility is diffuse growth, and this would be the case if cell division occurred throughout the organism. One place this does happen in plants is the leaves. So within a leaf, there's no meristems. Instead, all of the cells in that leaf have the potential to divide until that leaf reaches maturity. What are the advantages of having localized growth as we see in stems? Well, localized growth turns out to be important because plant cell walls are rigid and they are tightly attached to neighboring cells. So once they reach maturity, they're no longer able to get bigger and they're no longer able to separate from their neighbors. Under these conditions, they can't really divide. I suppose they could divide to the inside and make two smaller cells, but this could never lead to growth because once the cell divided, it would never be able to push outward and acquire more space for itself. So this basically means that plants are unable to do diffuse growth, at least anywhere where their cell walls have become rigid and tightly attached. This is the case especially in woody tissue, like we would get in many stems, and it's also true in much of the root. An advantage of localized growth is that it allows some parts of the plant to fully mature before the other parts have done so. Here's an example. So we have a schematic of a growing stem. Remember that the lower leaves on this stem were the first to develop, so they are more mature, and perhaps these have fully finished developing and are able to photosynthesize and acquire energy. Meanwhile, these leaves up here are just being made. They are not yet mature, not yet able to acquire energy. The lower leaves can supply the plant while these leaves mature. Once mature, then these leaves can participate too. The alternative to this would be that the entire stem had to fully mature before any of the leaves could start photosynthesizing. If everything grew at once, then that would be the necessary case. And in that case, the plant would not have enough energy to make all of its leaves, and therefore the plant would not be able to survive. Thus, the localized growth allows some parts of the plant to function even while other parts of the plant are forming. The alternative to localized growth was diffuse growth. This is when growth occurs throughout the organism, not just in specialized areas such as plant meristems. Diffuse growth is what we tend to see in most parts of animals, as well as some parts of the plant, for example, the leaves. Diffuse growth is able to occur where cells and attachments between cells are still flexible. That's because if a cell divides, its two daughter cells will be able to expand and create space for themselves by pushing apart the neighboring cells, so long as those neighboring cell walls are not tightly attached to one another at that point. When diffuse growth occurs, that means the entire structure, as in the entire leaf, or in the case of an animal, the entire animal is at the same developmental stage. So in the case of a leaf, the entire leaf is a young leaf, and the entire leaf matures simultaneously to be a mature leaf. In the case of an animal, then we start with a young immature animal that matures as a whole into a fully mature one. What is the advantage of diffuse growth? This model works well when all parts of the system need to work in order for the system to work. For example, in an animal, it wouldn't make any sense for our stomach to mature first, and then our small intestine, and then after that our large intestine, because the stomach can't do anything until the two intestines are functional. So instead, it makes sense in an animal to have all of the digestive system develop and mature at the same time. The next distinction we will make is between indeterminate and determinate growth. In indeterminate growth, then the organism can, at least in theory, grow indefinitely. This applies to stem and root elongation. So in the schematic here, this stem could, in theory, continue growing forever and ever and ever until it was well off the screen. Obviously, in practice, nothing can grow forever because the organism is going to run out of energy or run out of nutrients. But when we say it could, in theory, do this, what we mean is that there is nothing based on its genetics that is going to prevent it from doing so. It's simply going to be nutrition or signals from other parts of the plant that cause it to stop doing so. So with indeterminate growth, we get new structures continually added. For the stem, this would be leaves, and apical or axillary meristems would continually be added at every node. For a root, then we would have new root hairs continually added in the region of maturation, we would also have new lateral roots forming in the region above that. The alternative is determinate growth. In determinate growth, then growth is going to eventually cease, and this is going to be based on genetically based developmental plans. So this means that even if the plant has plenty of nutrients, plenty of energy, and is getting positive signals from the rest of the plant, it's still going to stop what it's doing. One example of this is leaves. Leaves do not keep expanding and getting larger and larger. Instead, they eventually stop expanding when they reach the desired size, and the plant, instead of further expanding it, moves on to make a different leaf instead. Determinate growth also happens in flowers, and we see this when we get a finite number of structures added to a part of the flower before it stops. And this happens in many species for the number of petals, anthers, and carpels. An example is shown here with an apple flower. This is a typical flower in the rose family, and you can see there are exactly 5 petals, and I believe there are exactly 10 anthers. And unless something goes wrong during development, that's going to be true for every apple flower on this tree. It's going to be true that there's 10 stamen in each of the flowers as well. So the numbers have been determined not by the resource level of the plant, but by something in the plant's genetic code. What are the advantages of indeterminate growth? One is that it allows considerable flexibility to continue growing as long as conditions are favorable. So if the plant has enough energy and nutrients, then why not be able to add more stem material and increase the ability to do photosynthesis? Indeterminate growth also means that if the plant is doing very well, it can increase its reproductive output. It can make more flowers, more fruit, and more seeds proportionate to the amount of stem material it has. This wouldn't be true in an animal. A female animal, let's say, only has one uterus and can only make some predetermined number of offspring, at least for mammals, in any given period of time, regardless of energy levels or nutrient status. Let's contrast that with determinate growth. There are advantages to determinate growth, and one is that this allows fine-tuning of form. This is going to be important for organisms with complex body plans and specialized functions. So we've already said that animals tend to have more complex body plans and more specialized functions than do plants. So for example, it's important that our fingers are all relatively close to each other in size for us to be able to grasp objects. It's important that our teeth are laid out alongside one another with similar spacing, so we are able to chew food, and that our tongue is a reasonable size to fit within our mouth. All of these things would not work if any of those organs had indeterminate growth and some teeth grew larger or smaller than neighbors, or if our tongue continued elongating just because there was enough energy or nutrients. An example in flowers, we said that flowers have determinate growth. This relates to the fact that floral function is relatively complex. A flower needs to attract pollinators. It needs to deposit pollen on that pollinator so it will carry it. It also needs to gather pollen from that pollinator in the hopes of getting its own ovules fertilized. Doing all of these things is relatively complicated, and so flowers are fine-tuned to maximize their ability to do so. This is one of the reasons that most flowers show determinate growth. We're now going to move on to talk about some different patterns of reproduction rather than different kinds of body plans. And we're going to make several distinctions. The first distinction is between polycarpy and monocarpy. Polycarpic plants are those that reproduce repeatedly throughout their lives. This typically means across multiple seasons or years. This is going to include virtually all trees and shrubs. It's also going to include many herbs. And here's just a couple of examples. This is a blueberry bush, for example. It's going to make blueberries every summer. And this is a raspberry bush, which will also make, in this case, raspberries once a year. Monocarpic plants reproduce only once and then die. This applies to most of our crops and many but not all of our garden flowers. So one example of a crop is okra, which I happen to be growing in my garden now, but I got a better picture from another source. And okra basically grows for a couple of months and then proceeds to make okra fruit for a couple of months. In that process, it uses up all of the energy reserves and all of the nutrients that's stored in its leaves, and the leaves slowly fall off. Eventually, you're left with basically a tall stem, some dead leaves. You harvest the remaining fruit, and that plant then dies. Another example is a garden flower. So this is coxcomb, which is it happens to make edible seeds, but most people just grow it for the attractive flowers. And this is going to similarly continue extending its inflorescence and making more and more flowers, taking all of its energy from its leaves until again the plant runs out of leaf material. It's invested all of those nutrients into its flowers and seeds, and then that plant dies. That's okay because that usually happens in fall, and then we start over replanting with new seeds in the spring. So whenever we have two strategies, it's worth asking, what are the advantages of each strategy? So let's start with monocarpy. What are the advantages of being monocarpic? The nice thing about this strategy is that the organism does not need to save any nutrients or energy for subsequent survival or reproduction. This means it can invest everything it has in its offspring. That okra plant can make as many okra fruit as possible, and as a result, as many seeds as possible. That maximizes the chance of it being able to have seeds for the next generation. However, there's also advantages of polycarpy. A problem with monocarpy is that when the plant makes seeds, conditions could be bad. It could be that the weather is bad for pollinators, and so it never gets pollen transferred to its flowers. It's possible that the weather is simply bad for the plant. It's too cloudy, it doesn't get to make a lot of sugars, and therefore it can't make a lot of seeds. Or it could be a year where it does make a lot of seeds, but there's an outbreak of something that eats its seeds, and none of those seeds survive. So by being able to spread reproduction out across multiple years, then the polycarpic plant increases the chance that at least some of those years are favorable, and it increases therefore the chance that some of its seeds will get to survive and reproduce. Related to the distinction between polycarpic and monocarpic are annual, biennial, and perennial plants. We'll start with annuals. Annual, as the name implies, means 1 year, so an annual plant is a plant that lives less than or up to 1 year long. That means it completes its entire life cycle, germinating from seed, growing and developing, flowering, making seeds, and dying within this time period. An advantage to this is that it doesn't have to figure out a way to survive cold or dry season. For example, in South Carolina, it's hard for plants to survive the cold winter months. Elsewhere in the world, there's oftentimes a period of 2 or 3 very dry months that are challenging for survival. An annual plant can survive those periods in the seed form. So seeds get formed, they hang out until the end of the winter or the end of the dry period, and then they are able to germinate and grow when the conditions are better. And there's many examples of this. We just talked about coxcomb as an example of a garden plant. It is monocarpic, but it's also an annual because it completes its life cycle in 1 year. Wheat, but also all of our other grains, so oats and corn, for example, are monocarpic annuals. You plant the wheat in the spring or summer, you harvest it by late summer or fall, and the plants die. The next year they do not grow back. The farmer has to replant the entire field. There are some plants called winter annuals, and you can see Kermit is a big fan of winter annuals, especially when they have pretty flowers. This is oilseed rape in the picture. Oilseed rape is the plant that gives us canola oil, which is a major crop in particularly Canada and Europe, and it is used for cooking. So going back to the theme of winter annuals, these are a slight variation on the typical annual life cycle. In this case, the plants germinate and establish in the fall before it gets too cold outside. Then they overwinter, usually as small plants very near the ground. They do survive the winter conditions. Then in the spring they have a head start towards growing large and flowering before other plants that are starting as seeds in the spring. So the disadvantage to this is that they have to survive the winter, but the advantage is they get a head start and they're able to grow larger faster than other species that are just starting as seeds. Another strategy is being biennial. This is a slight variation on annuals. As the name implies, these are plants that are going to live for 2 years. In the first year, they grow vegetatively. This means that they make leaves, roots, and storage organs. They acquire energy, they store that energy, but they don't make any flowers. In the second year, they do make flowers with all of that energy they've collected and all of those nutrients. They use all of their energy and nutrients to make seeds, and once they've done so, then they are monocarpic, so they die. The only difference here between an annual and a biennial is that they do this in year 2 rather than year 1. Some examples of this are carrots and parsley. These are both in the parsley, or rather in the carrot family. And if you grow these plants, what that means is that you can plant them in 1 year, but you don't want to let them survive until the second year. If you do, then they're going to start using their stored energy. For example, the stored sugars in that carrot, they're going to start drawing it out of the carrot root in order to make carrot flowers, as pictured here on the right. While they're attractive flowers, we typically plant them for the food. So what that means is that it's important to harvest any biennial crop before that point in the second year where it starts to draw resources up from its storage organs. A third strategy is being perennial. So perennials are going to be plants that survive for more than 2 years as long as conditions permit. So if they survive for more than 2 years, many of these will live for 3 or 5 or sometimes hundreds or even longer years. This is going to include, in the way we're defining it here, trees and shrubs, as well as many garden herbs and many other herbaceous plants. We'll talk about what we mean by garden herbs and other herbs later in this lecture. I'm just going to give you a heads up here that the way the word perennial is used in the horticulture industry, so the gardening industry, is a little bit different. Typically for garden stores, if they use the word perennials, what they are referring to is herbaceous or soft-stemmed perennials. They will count trees and shrubs as their own category. Even though they do live multiple years, the fact that they're trees and shrubs implies that, so they don't use this word. We're going to use this word botanically, so we will use the word perennials for trees and shrubs, as well as herbs that live more than 2 years. Perennials are commonly found in gardens, and they're plants that I would recommend to any beginning gardener. They're also useful as landscape plants. And the reason I recommend them is that you only have to plant them once. So that's cheaper. It's one trip to the garden store instead of several, or instead of one every year. And once they get established, they tend to have reasonably large root systems, and they're able to store nutrients year to year. That means you can get away with taking care of them less well, and they will persist. And here's just a couple of examples of garden perennials. On the left, you have strawberry, and you've seen my strawberry patch, I believe, in a previous video. These will come back, and every year they will make more strawberries. The plants themselves will survive year to year. Another example is mint. People say that you plant mint once and then you spend the rest of your life removing the mint because it really likes to spread. So this is a very easy plant to get started. You basically put it in the ground and it continues to spread. Your only job is to make sure it doesn't spread further than you want it to. So we're going to talk about herbs compared to woody plants now. We use the term herb in botany differently than it's used in the culinary sense. And your book talks about this distinction. I also addressed it in a short video that I made showing these plants growing outside. So make sure that you can explain what is the food-related definition and as compared to the botanical definition. You should also be able to address the question, are all herbs in the culinary sense also herbs in the botanical sense? Then, with regard to stems, you should be able to explain what kind of meristem produces all of the stem material in herbs. And related to this, what two additional kinds of meristems produce stem material in woody plants? Finally, you should be able to specify whether herbs or woody plants typically grow larger, and you should be able to explain why this is. And again, this was all explained in the assigned reading, so I'm not asking you to go do any outside research beyond that. I'm going to end with a few final thoughts. First, going back to the part of this lecture about reproductive structures. Remember that the reproductive structures differ among major plant groups. What they all have in common is that they all have some stage in which there is sexual reproduction by both eggs and sperm. With regard to growth patterns, we talked about simple growth patterns, localized growth, and indeterminate growth as applying to many instances with plants. These three things all work well together. So simple repeating units are easy to add with localized growth. One part of the plant, in other words, a meristem, can make repeating units like leaves without having to coordinate that growth with other parts of the plant. If it was complex growth, then that would be much harder to do without some more complex coordination. Additionally, because localized growth in plants occurs at the apices of stems and the tips or the apices of roots, these apices are usually in places where there's space available. So this allows the plant to be able to continue elongating its stems and its roots almost indefinitely. Obviously, at some point, it's going to reach physical or nutritional limits. With regard to reproductive patterns, we've talked about annual plants, we've talked about herbs, and we've talked about monocarpy versus polycarpy. So we can say here that annual plants are always going to be herbs, and they are monocarpic. Because they don't live for multiple growing seasons, they don't live long enough to merit making true wood. Also, they use up all of their resources in reproduction within the first year, meaning that they don't have a chance to survive to a second year and reproduce again. Therefore, they're monocarpic, not polycarpic. And this strategy can be useful because they don't need to store nutrients for survival from year to year. Thus, within a particular year, they're able to invest everything into reproduction. So it's not that annual plants are inferior to perennial plants. It's just a different lifestyle that has its own advantages. And fourth, with regard to reproductive patterns, perennials can be herbs or they can be woody plants. So a perennial, remember, lives more than 2 years, but there's different ways of achieving that. They could have leaves that can survive the winter, or they can have stems that die back to the ground, and they can survive based on their underground roots. And then they can regrow above ground, and so this is a strategy that does not require them to make wood, but still allows them to be perennial. Most larger plants do make wood for support. Your book talks about a couple of exceptions to this, but if you think about what it requires to be large and for the weight of the plant to be held up, it makes sense that most of these plants are going to have wood for its strength and support. Also, with regard to perennials, perennials are usually polycarpic. So I talked about the example of the giant agave that is perennial but monocarpic. That's an exception. In most cases, plants that survive more than 1 or 2 years are going to spread out reproduction and do a little bit of reproduction in each of those years, rather than saving all of their resources for the final year and having one large reproductive event. By spreading out the reproduction over many years, it gives them more of a chance for at least some of their seeds to be able to survive and be successful in those favorable years.